Order, order. Mr Talamajid Singh Desi to move the motion.
Sir Edward, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I beg to move that this House has considered imprisonment for public protection. Sentences of imprisonment for public protection, IPP sentences, are an often overlooked part of our criminal justice system, despite the huge impact they have on those prisoners who are continuing to serve them. They were intended to protect the public from serious offenders and ensure that dangerous, violent and sexual offenders stayed in custody for as long as they presented a risk to society. Under the IPP regime, offenders granted an IPP were set a minimum term that they must spend in prison, but unlike most other sentences, there was no upper limit, meaning that once the minimum tariff was served, they must then apply to the parole board for release. Only if the parole board is satisfied that they were not a danger to the public can someone serving an IPP sentence be released. Release is therefore not automatic, and if the parole board are not satisfied that someone serving an IPP sentence has demonstrated that they no longer pose a risk, the prisoner can remain in custody indefinitely. Sir Edward, I have discussed these concerns with colleagues, including the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, my honourable friend, the member for Leeds East, who too realises the gravity of this important issue and how it impacts on so many families, and hence why I applied for the matter to be debated amongst honourable and right honourable members in Parliament. Yes.
Thank you very much for allowing me to intervene. The point that he's just made is a very important one. This has a big impact on families, and I don't think that we should lose sight of that as we go through this debate. The other point about it is that the number of prisoners who commit self-harm during this is much higher than across the rest of the prison population. So does he think that these two factors should play a part in his thinking?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and with great eloquence he has highlighted two of the key issues as to why this debate is so important, and I concur fully with his views. In many cases, Sir Edward, IPP sentences that had shorter tariffs of less than 2 years have become in effect a life sentence, as people have been stuck in limbo, unable to prove that they no longer pose a risk, often for reasons beyond their control. For those IPP sentenced prisoners, the sentences did not work as intended and instead have become an unfairly punitive aspect of our criminal justice system. It is on those prisoners that I would like to focus my remarks today, as it is those on the shortest tariffs that have experienced the injustice. So, Sir Edward, why were IPP sentenced abolished in the first place? Whilst designed to protect the public from serious offenders, the reality is that IPP sentences were handed down for a far broader range of offences than was intended. They were handed down at a rate of more than 800 per year, moving thousands of people into prison indefinitely. This led to offenders who had committed more minor crimes facing a short tariff but an indefinite sentence. The Prison Reform Trust late last year published a report which found that over half of prisoners still serving an IPP had a tariff of 4 years or less, and 15% had a tariff of less than 2 years. Custody and imprisonment should be used as a last resort, and indefinite custody with no fixed end should only be used for where a very serious offence has been committed. I fully appreciate there are cases where individuals have committed heinous crimes against humanity, and therefore the local community is extremely concerned about prisoners' release. One such case was highlighted to me by the Brexit Minister, the Honourable Member for Worcester, wherein he and his predecessor had both worked with the local community to highlight their very serious concerns about someone who had killed and impaled 3 children onto railings after murdering them in their home. However, what I am most concerned about are those non-serious cases wherein someone is sentenced to a short sentence and ends up being imprisoned for years on end. Where people are safe to be released, we should not be keeping them in custody to serve many multiples of their tariff for the crimes that they have committed. It stands against the principles of natural justice on which our justice system is founded. The more widespread use of IPPs than was intended has also led to a number of instances where offenders committing the same offence in the same context, were handed sentences where one offender could be expected to spend a lot longer in prison. Even the author of IPP Sentences, Sir Edward, David Blunkett, acknowledges that this was a flawed policy. Lord Blunkett noted, and I quote, "The consequence of bringing that act in has led, in some cases, to an injustice, and I regret that." In 2012, the government rightly took the decision to abolish sentences of imprisonment for public protection for offenders, meaning that it was no longer an option available to judges. However, whilst it was the right decision, the issue remains of what to do to address those who are currently serving an IPP sentence. Yes.
Grateful for giving way. He's right in recognising that these sentences have now been abolished, and the Parole Board previously aimed to get the IPP prisoner population below 1,500 by 2020, but latest figures show that the number of people still serving these IPP sentences is above 2,400. So given these sentences have actually abolished, does my honourable friend agree that actually those that continue to serve under these sentences should actually be resentenced under the rules that exist at the moment?
I thank my honourable friend, and I think with great telepathy, I too will be referring to the Parole Board and the statistic that she has very ably highlighted, and I fully agree with her. Sir Edward, that is the issue that the current government, has to grapple with, and the problem remains a real one for the prisoners, for their families, for the justice system, and for wider society that needs to have confidence in a justice system that rehabilitates and is fair and proportionate. Let's examine the continued use of IPP sentences. On the 31st of March 2019, as my honourable friend for Lewisham West and Penja has highlighted, there were 2,403 prisoners still serving an IPP sentence who were yet to be released, despite the abolition of the sentence over 7 years ago. Of these, 9 out of 10 have already served their minimum tariff that was handed down to them by the judge at their trial. A large proportion of those still serving an IPP sentence, after surpassing their original tariff, were initially sent to prison to serve a short tariff. Of the close to 400 people on an IPP sentence with a tariff of less than 2 years, over half have served 9 years or more beyond their original tariff, which is a travesty, I feel. And my honourable friend, the member for Stretford and Urmston, who can't be here today, has also informed me that a recent parliamentary question she tabled revealed that there are currently 46 women on IPP sentences, yet the Ministry of Justice does not know how many of these women have children. Given that this is such a low number and the impact of mothers' imprisonment on children is well documented, I believe that that is a shocking admission. And the Parole Board predicts that unless changes are made to the situation faced by the IPP prisoners, there will still be 1,500 people in prison serving an IPP sentence by 2020. And to illustrate, Sir Edward, the issues faced by people still serving IPP sentences, I want to draw attention to some particularly tragic examples of the effect that the indefinite nature of IPP sentences can have on those prisoners sentenced to them. Yes.
I'm very grateful. Just before he goes on to highlight his examples, I raised the case of my constituent Wayne Bell, who has had a mental health crisis and is now unable to engage with the parole process. And given that there was a study a few years ago that said that 1 in 10 IPP prisoners were seeking psychiatric help in prison, double the rate for the normal prison population, does he share my concern that prisoners can easily get into a downward spiral where they have a mental health crisis, they're not able to engage with the parole process, it makes them more depressed, and there's no way out of that sort of downward spiral for them, and there's no way of them being able to resolve their situations?
I thank my honourable friend, Sir Edward, for his excellent intervention. And indeed, he has encapsulated the issue at hand in terms of mental health issues and the intertwined nature of what we are actually discussing. And I will elaborate further on the mental health problems faced by prisoners. But let me highlight, first of all, the case of Tommy Nicol. In 2009, Tommy Nicol received an IPP sentence with a minimum 4-year tariff for stealing a car from a mechanic's garage and injuring a man's arm in the process. Once his tariff was completed, the parole board refused his request to be released and told him he should access a therapeutic community in order to address his mental health issues and become safe to be released. Tommy's mental health suffered as he was repeatedly denied access to mental health treatment courses. He was moved to prisons which did not even offer those courses, proving that he had been rehabilitated increasingly difficult. In November 2014, he made a formal complaint saying that IPP sentences were a form of psychological torture. And around this time, he also began to self-segregate and went on hunger strike. His behaviour became increasingly erratic as he understandably struggled to deal with the psychological impact of his situation. Tommy, tragically, Sir Edward, took his own life in prison in September 2015. And let's also examine the case of James Ward, who was given an IPP sentence in 2006 with a tariff of 1 year, only 1 year, for setting light to his mattress while in prison, serving a fixed sentence for a fight with his father. He ended up serving not 1 year, but serving 11 years.
On that point,
Yes.
for giving way, does he agree with me that the case of arsonists is often serious in this IPP sentence structure? Because of the links between arson and sex offending and reckless behaviour, they have been disproportionately affected by this.
I thank my honourable friend, and she has very ably made that point with respect to how arsonists end up serving a lot longer than they should, and it just is not fair in terms of the fairness within the system. That is not there. And in that time, Sir Edward, in terms of James Ward, he regularly self-harmed and his mental health deteriorated significantly. He has since spoken out about the damage the IPP sentence did to his mental health, telling the Today programme, and I quote, "Prison is not fit to accommodate people like me with mental health problems. It's made me worse. How can I change in a place like this? I wake up every morning scared of what the day may hold." And let's also delve into the impact of IPP sentences on prisoners, of people stuck in limbo with a lack of access to courses and treatments. These cases show how much more needs to be done to address the issue faced by those serving IPP sentences. They also highlight a particular issue of IPP sentenced prisoners not being able to complete the courses that the parole board has told them that that will help demonstrate that they are safe for release. Partly this is because we face an increasingly violent and overcrowded prison system where there are simply not enough places on the relevant courses and therefore not enough opportunities for short tariff IPP sentenced prisoners to demonstrate that they no longer pose risk. But there are also other problems which are easier to fix. For example, the families of IPP sentenced prisoners have said that prisoners are prioritised for places on courses based on how close they are to their release date. Because IPP sentenced prisoners do not have a fixed release date, they therefore fall to the back of the queue and can struggle to ever get on the appropriate courses. In his reply, I would be very grateful if the Minister could provide an update today on what is being done to address this particular issue. And Sir Edward, if we look at mental health problems, which many of my honourable colleagues have highlighted, IPP sentences have a huge impact on prisoners, as they would do on anyone who is locked up and deprived of their liberty with no end in sight. They create a sense of despair and a feeling of hopelessness, which can have a significant impact on an individual's mental health, demonstrated by the fact that IPP prisoners are significantly more likely to self-harm than determinate sentence prisoners, and even more than life sentence prisoners, which is an amazing statistic. This is borne out by the numerous reports, such as those by the Prison Reform Trust, the Sainsbury's Centre for Mental Health, the Howard League for Penal Reform, and the Institute for Criminal Policy Research at King's College London. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons found that found that IPP prisoners were significantly more likely than life or determinate sentence prisoners to have arrived in their current prison with problems, including feeling depressed and suicidal. Mental health issues are already endemic in our prison system, with at least 1 in 3 prisoners reported to have mental health issues by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons reports, and a much greater figure more likely in reality. And instances of self-harm are already too high, with 55,598 instances in 2018 alone. We need to see a comprehensive and fully funded strategy for the reduction of all forms of violence in prison, including self-harm, and that must include special support for those on IPP sentences. Could the Minister specifically outline today what special provision is made for tackling mental health conditions of IPP prisoners, especially those with shorter tariffs, but who have served way beyond it, and so who probably never expected to be in this situation? Sir Edward, another issue that affects the prisoners' ability to rehabilitate and turn their life around is recall. When an IPP sentenced prisoner is released, they are released on licence with strict licence conditions that must be followed. Breaching these conditions can result in recall to prison. In many cases, this is a correct and appropriate response, but there are cases where technical breaches, for example, missing a probation meeting because of unforeseen illness or travel delays, has resulted in recall to prison. The excessive use of recalls to prisons for minor breaches of licence has contributed to the number of IPP prisoners remaining in prison staying stubbornly high. Families of those serving IPP sentences have called for a more reasonable approach to recalls to be taken to ensure that only those breaches which suggest someone poses a risk should necessitate the deprivation of an individual's liberty. Minor breaches of licensing conditions are often not crimes in of themselves, but simple things like missing appointments and breaching administrative conditions. The ex-head of the parole board told of offenders sent back to prison for turning up drunk at their bail hostel, even though that presented no risk to anybody. And repeated recall to prison whilst on release on licence also prevents an IPP prisoner from securing housing and holding down a job, both of which are factors which are proven to reduce reoffending rates. And indeed, 936 people on IPP sentences were released by the parole board in 2017. In the same year, 543 people on IPPs were recalled. This is a complex and serious issue that will only be tackled, Sir Edward, with proper coordination between the Ministry of Justice, prisons, probation and the police. So could the Minister please outline what is his government strategy to tackle the issue about recall? The only way that an IPP prisoner can be finally entirely released from an IPP sentence is to apply to the parole board 10 years after their release from custody to have their licence ended. And many experts and campaigners have rightly pointed out that they believe that this is simply too long and sets people up to fail. Does the Minister have plans to amend this? And before concluding, I want to highlight, Sir Edward, the impact of IPP sentences on our justice system. IPP sentences don't just have a detrimental impact on the mental health and stability of offenders, both whilst in prison and during release on their extraordinarily long licences. They're also detrimental to the efficient running of the prison and parole system. The parole board has historically heard the cases of offenders convicted of longer sentences than those who were subject to IPP sentences, but are now forced to conduct a lengthy risk assessment process for short tariff offenders on IPP sentences. There is also no doubt that the rapid increase in the number of those on IPPs contributed to prison overcrowding, and that it still continues despite the abolition of IPP sentences because of the difficulties many IPP sentence prisoners have in demonstrating they are safe to be released. The prison population has risen significantly since 1994 and then again since 2000, following changes to minimum sentences, and the UK, Sir Edward, now has the highest imprisonment rate in Western Europe, with 141 prisoners per 100,000 of the population. Our prisons are also often dangerously overcrowded, with many prisons operating at significantly over their certified capacity. This overcrowding has a detrimental impact on safety, which has fallen considerably under this government, with prisons substantially more violent now than in the past, and also on the ability of prisons to effectively rehabilitate offenders, with overcrowding repeatedly raised as an area of concern by Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons due to its effect on what resources are available to reduce reoffending. Sir Edward, in conclusion, it is now time for IPP sentences to be resolved. There have been continued calls for further change, including from former Justice Secretaries, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons and the Chair of the Parole Board, which focus on the unfairness for prisoners still serving IPP sentences and on the challenges that it creates for the prison system. While abolishing the use of new IPP sentences was a correct course of action, there is still more to be done to address the issues faced by those who were sent to prison for a short tariff that is effectively now turned into a life sentence. The families of those on IPP sentences are themselves making proposals that may well offer a way forward. For example, Donna, the sister of Tommy Nicol, who I referred to earlier, is now campaigning for reforms to the system faced by IPP sentenced prisoners. She has called for those serving initial tariffs of 4 years or less, as her brother was, to have their sentences converted to fixed sentences. Is that something the Minister is looking at? There are many suggested ways of reforming these outlawed sentences, ensuring public safety and justice has been served. Some suggestions from the criminal justice reform sector include converting IPP sentences to fixed-length sentences, starting with the shorter tariffs, and protecting the public with minimum licence periods. The government, I think, needs to finish the job that it has started. The challenge now is for the government to lay out how it will ensure that this wrong is finally righted. Until it is, it will remain a stain on our justice system.